Welcome to Context TV. In the wake of the financial and economic crisis in the US and Europe, as well as the social protests around the world, a basic critique of capitalism and a discussion about alternatives has gained again some form of attention. At the same time, a lot of people in Europe and in the United States are dissatisfied with the way the economy works. According to polls, 80% of Germans want a different economic system. 40% of the population in the United States has a negative attitude toward capitalism. In the Pew Research Center poll, a majority of young Americans preferred socialism over market economy. In this broadcast, we want to talk about alternatives. Our guest is US writer, activist and economist Michael Albert. More than 20 years ago, he already outlined an alternative economic system, which he calls Participatory Economy, or Parecon. Recently, he founded the International Organization for a Participatory Society. It should be a global network for movements, activists and dissidents, with national chapters around the world, also in Europe. Michael Albert is co-founder of the alternative publishing house Southend Press and ZNet, one of the most renowned global platforms for left critique, social change and activism, where dissidents like Noam Chomsky, Arundhati Roy, John Pilger, Naomi Klein or Tariq Ali are regularly publishing articles and essays. Albert is author of many books, among them Realizing Hope, Life Beyond Capitalism.
Kontext TV hat Michael Albert im August in seinem Haus in Woods Hall auf Cape Cod in Massachusetts besucht.
You have outlined an alternative economic system not only to capitalism but also to a centrally planned socialism and bioregionalism. You call it a participatory economy. Explain exactly what you mean by that.
As you say, it means to be an alternative to capitalism, which is a system that we live under in the United States, you live under in Germany. It means to be an alternative to the system called central planned economy, centrally planned. It's typically called centrally planned socialist economy. I call it a centrally planned coordinatorist economy. We'll come to that in a second. What was in East Germany, Soviet Union, and so on. It's also an alternative to that. And as you say, it's also an alternative to another idea, hasn't existed, bioregionalism, just the notion that regions should be self-sufficient and should function sort of autonomously from one another. Okay, so participatory economics is basically, it's not a blueprint. It says, here are some key institutional commitments at the heart of an economy, which if we have these, then we will have an economy which is desirable. We will have an economy which doesn't have classes, doesn't have one set of people dominating, ruling, aggrandizing themselves at the expense of another set of people. Moreover, it will have people controlling their own lives, self-managing. It will have diversity of outcomes. It will have solidarity between people. In other words, it won't have, as markets do, for example, a context in which to get ahead you have to trample others. Rather, it'll have a context in which there's mutual aid. So, what kind of institutions accomplish these kinds of ends? Equitable distribution, so it's fair. What participatory economics advocates is just a few simple institutions. One, workers and consumers councils, or assemblies, some places would call it, councils, I'll call it, that are self-managing. So that just means in the workplace, for example, the workers, which is everybody in the workplace, constitute a council or an assembly of the workplace, and they are the decision-making body. And they make decisions in a manner that is organized by the principle of self-management, and the principle means I should have a say in decisions in proportion as I'm affected by them, and so should everybody else. So there isn't, somebody who has way disproportionate say and other people who have less say. So that's one institution. We can talk about it more if you want. Second institution has to do with income distribution. Society, an economy produces a lot of stuff. Think of it as a giant pie. When we're talking about income distribution, all we're talking about is what size slice do you get, right? How much do you get? Maybe the quality of the slice. So it's the amount and the quality. Your share of the social output. Now, there's lots of norms that you can have for that. You can say people should get a slice that is proportionate to the amount of productive assets of means of production that they own. So in that case, Bill Gates is worth more, say, than the population of Norway. I mean, I don't know, but that's probably close to true. And more than the population of, a few countries in Central America. So I don't like that option. These are values. It's not like 2 and 2 is 4. It's not true or false. You either like it or you don't like it. I don't like it. It's not equitable. It's not fair. It's not just. It's not humane. Another possible norm that you could have is that people get income based on their power. If I'm more powerful and I can take more, I get more. It's a bargaining process, right? So your power determines your income. That's actually operative in market systems. That's quite typical in Germany, say, and in the United States. Both the property norm and the power norm are at play. Another norm which people think is at play, but which I don't like anyway, but a lot of socialists like, or a lot of market socialists or centrally planned socialists like, is that you should get back in proportion to the amount that you contribute. So if I produce, by my efforts, by my labors, a certain amount of that social pie, I should get back essentially an equivalent amount. Not the same stuff. Maybe I produce only bicycles. I don't get back only bicycles, but I get back an amount that is comparable in value to the amount that I produce. This means that Michael Jordan was underpaid when he was earning $20 or $30 million a year, because the value of his product, a lot of leftists don't want to hear this, but the value of his product in terms of how much people wanted to watch Michael Jordan play basketball was way more than $20 million. Who else got it? The people with property. The owners of Nike, the owners of the basketball team he played on, the owners of the TV network. Lots of owners got it. People had more power than him. He had enough power to take a lot. But if you played him according to output, he would have gotten even more. Okay, I don't like that. I don't think people should, on top of being lucky enough to be born with some incredible talents, Frank Sinatra's voice, Michael Jordan's athletic prowess, Chomsky's brain, whatever, right? To be lucky enough to be born with these attributes, to be then showered with wealth on top of it makes no sense to me. You shouldn't reward luck in the genetic lottery. So if you're not going to remunerate for power, and you're not going to remunerate for output, and you're not going to remunerate for property, what are you going to remunerate for? Well, the second institutional commitment of participatory economics is to remunerate for how long you work, for how hard you work, and for the intensity of your work, how hard you work. So it's how duration, intensity, and then onerousness of conditions. So in other words, if I work longer, I get more. If I work harder, I get more. And if I work under worse conditions, I get more, as long as I'm producing something valuable. I can't produce junk and get remunerated for it. I can't be the goalie for the German national soccer team and get remunerated for it because it's worthless, right? So I can't do that. But I can do something that I can do and get remunerated for it, for how long I do it, how hard I do it, and the onerousness of conditions under which I do it. So that's the second institutional commitment. Third institutional commitment is something called balanced job complexes. This one gets a trifle more complicated, but not much. In contemporary economies, like Germany and the United States, there is the owning class. The Occupy movement likes to say 1%. It's actually more like 2%, I think, but a very small number, who basically own the productive assets of society and accrue the great bulk of the profit and are incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy. And then there are working people who have no say, have no power, have no circumstances that give them ability to take much of income. But in between those two, there's another group. And that other group I call the coordinator class. And that other group does have something. The capitalists have a monopoly on property. The coordinator class has a monopoly on empowering tasks and positions in the economy. So lawyers and doctors and engineers and various other actors, accountants and so on, high-level managers, who have the empowering work and the power that comes with the empowering work, which gives them the ability to take from that social product, that pie, a lot of income, and to have a lot of say about the direction of the economy. Not only that, that class in between labor and capital, a coordinator class, can become the new ruling class. That's the system called centrally planned socialism and market socialism. does away with owners, does away with capitalists, but it leaves that 20%, and that's what it is, roughly 20%, in charge. So, participatory economics doesn't want that. It wants classlessness. So it not only wants to get rid of private ownership of all the workplaces and all the resources and everything else so that those aren't in the hands of 2%, but it wants to get rid of 20% monopolizing all the empowering work. There's only one way to do that I can think of, and that's get rid of it. You can't have 20% monopolize all the empowering work. This is not complicated. So that means you must distribute it among the population. So you must have something we call balanced job complexes, which simply means that everybody in the economy who's working, who's able-bodied and working, does a mix of responsibilities and tasks and activities. And the mix is such that each person has comparably empowering work. So you no longer have somebody who's doing only empowering tasks. You have instead people, there are still people who do surgery, and there are still people who do, calculations and et cetera, et cetera. But they also do disempowering tasks, and they do a mix. And the mix is such that for each person in the economy, comparably speaking, we all, from our work, are comparably empowered. So that means we can all participate, rather than some of us being exhausted, dead, having no information, no knowledge, nothing to bring to the table, and others doing all the deciding. So that's balanced job complexes. Finally, you got to get rid of markets and central planning. And the reason you have to get rid of those, without going on too long, is that their structures and their implications, what's built into the dynamics of markets and central planning, working precisely the way they're supposed to work, not corrupted, not taken over by a bad person, but doing what they're structurally, inclined to do, are horrifically destructive. They destroy self-management, they destroy solidarity, they destroy equity, and so on and so forth. They destroy all these values that we aspire to. So we can't have them. So participatory economics, in the place of that, comes up with something called participatory planning. It'll take even longer to describe that, so I won't, except to say that the idea is that the workers and consumers councils cooperatively negotiate. They engage in a process with each other that arrives at inputs and outputs. Central planning arrives at inputs and outputs by way of command, reaction, command, obedience. Markets arrive at it by way of competition that is very skewed to the powerful. Participatory planning arrives at it, the final results, what's going to go in and out of the economy, what's produced here, what's consumed there, by way of cooperative negotiation among the actors. It's consistent with self-management, it's consistent with the other institutions. So that's it. Just workers and consumers self-managing councils, equitable remuneration for duration, intensity, and onerousness of socially valued labor, balanced job complexes, and participatory planning. Beyond that, everything else will vary from place to place and time to time and country to country. Even the implementation of those four will take on various different attributes. But the basics of those four, I think, will be the same in a participatory economy, and it is what will allow and indeed propel that economy to being classless and to being equitable and to treating people like people instead of like, means to the end of the empowerment and the enrichment of the few. So that's participatory economics as an alternative.
We right now see the dysfunctionalities of the capitalist system. What is your stance on that? And couldn't it be that this is a good chance for implementing a kind of an alternative participatory economic system?
One thing that, always strikes me as strange. We're told that this current epoch, these last few years since the bubble and the collapse and so on, and with the recessions and maybe the depression and in Europe, all kinds of mess, that it makes evident that capitalism doesn't work. Well, it's certainly true that it makes evident that capitalism doesn't work in a moment of its discombobulation. But nothing works when it's discombobulated. What's really critical about capitalism is that it's always in crisis. The difference between this crisis and the always crisis is that this crisis is affecting the powerful and the rich also, which is why it's talked about and publicly discussed and why there has to be an agenda to deal with it. Before this mess, right, there was still, 10 million people a year dying of preventable deaths around the world, probably more like 100 million, dying of preventable disease and of starvation and so on. Well, that's a crisis. Isn't that a crisis? Am I missing something someplace? No, it's not a crisis for mainstream media because it's the others who are dying. It's not a crisis. The fact that people work with no dignity and no control over that, that's not a crisis, because me, journalist extraordinaire, I have control over my life, right? And I pay no attention to the plight of those people. So when this current crisis comes along and it starts to make inroads against my comfort, my meaning the elites, it becomes a crisis. So that's the first thing to notice, that what you say is absolutely true. The current situation, which aggravates it for everyone, and makes it even worse, and therefore breaks the normal mode and opens people's eyes, it's all true. But there's something strange about it also. People who live in the inner city in the United States are always in crisis. People who live under the poverty line are always in crisis, right? It doesn't require, a sort of a disruption of the system, right? Which is what we have now, right? To create their pain. Their pain is the normal order of business. Okay, that said, it is true that what's going on now creates a context in which a great many people are thinking in a way that they haven't often before. Well, maybe we need an alternative. Maybe we need something else. Maybe we need to get on about, So there's two ways of looking at the current crisis. One way is to say, how do we get out of it and get back to a situation where the elites, the constituencies of people who have the wealth and the power, are in the same place they were before, or even better off. That's the way of getting out of the current crisis that's being followed by governments who represent those elites. That's what's going on throughout Europe and the United States. There's slight arguments about it. But now there's a whole other way to come at the crisis and to say, well, wait a minute, your question. Can we get out of this crisis in a way which isn't about getting back to where we were before, but is about going forward to a situation in which we have real equity, we have real justice, in which those who have for so long gotten the short straw, gotten the raw deal from society, get a fair deal? Can we reverse the situation? Can we reduce the disparities or even eliminate the disparities and have something equitable? So that's a different way of approaching the crisis. And the more people think about it that way, the more they'll start thinking about not only dissenting, whether it's in the streets of Madrid or Berlin or in Wisconsin or New York, not only dissenting, not only being dissidents, but maybe trying to conceive, okay, where do we go? What changes do we require? What demands can we make? What structures can we build to push through to a whole new society? And that's obviously where my, my inclinations are.
In a certainly limited way, the principles of Parecon are already existent in our societies. We have cooperatives, worker-owned, worker-managed facilities in Latin America, Europe, but also here in the United States. You have Mondragon in Spain. What are the experiences made there, and what are your own experiences building up the publishing house, ZNet, and the South End Press?
One of the problems is, suppose you create an institution. So it might be a small publishing house, it might be a big institution, let's say it's an auto plant. And workers, the owners who were there before, or if it's done from scratch, there are no owners, and the owners who were there before leave. So in Argentina, that happened in many, many workplaces. Basically, the economy goes to hell in a handcart, the owners decide they've got to get out, and when they go, interestingly enough, the coordinator class, the engineers and the managers, they go also because they think, well, this is going to fall apart. So they leave also. So now the workers are left and they want to keep their jobs. So they take over the workplace. And that happened all over Argentina. Not all over, but in many, many firms, hundreds in Argentina. Or it could happen the same outcome by a different route could happen by people just getting together and forming a workers' co-op, or by workers perhaps buying a workplace and putting it under the auspices of the whole workforce. So it's a good thing, and it's moving in the kind of direction, I think you're right, that's Pareconish, or at least could be Pareconish, let's call it. But there are dangers. So for instance, you can do that, and you can keep the old division of labor. And in keeping the old division of labor, you can wind up with something that isn't capitalist in the way it used to be because the owners were gone, but is horrible in the way that East Germany was, or the Soviet Union was. So in other words, you can set up institutions that don't have owners, but that do have 20% ruling over 80%. And in fact, it's hard to avoid. If you're operating within a market system, if you're dealing with banks, if you're dealing with all kinds of institutions and cultural assumptions in the society, which just take for granted that there will be a few leaders, that there will be some people who are responsible and other people who are obedient, that there'll be huge disparities in income and so on and so forth. So if you think of something like, say, a nonprofit, the Ford Foundation, or some nonprofit institution, it's not owned, it's not privately owned, but it can look marginally different from a privately owned institution, and that's because it retains that. So my answer is yes. I think that the existence of a tremendous number of co-ops, particularly in the United States, actually there's a huge number in the United States, a large number of co-ops, a large number of nonprofits, a large number of institutions that are attempting to be alternative to in some way or another, is a wonderful thing. But it becomes powerful if they don't all operate independently, but they have some degree of unity, and if the unity comes from an understanding of what they're trying to achieve. And what they're trying to achieve has to be real classlessness, not just the elevation of the 20%. Once that is on board, once that understanding is in place, then you really have something. In Argentina, I don't know how much time we have. We have time for a little story? Okay. In Argentina, I was in a glass factory visiting. And I'm talking to some of the people, and I ask who's doing the finances now. Because the glass factory, the owners left, the engineers left, the accountants left, the 20% left. Right? It wasn't just the owners who left, but the 20% of the coordinator class that was left. And what remained was the people who were doing the rote labor. So it was about 80% of the work force with very, very, very little education, and with very little confidence, and with very little knowledge of the overarching characteristics of the firm. And yet they had to keep it going. Now, they did keep it going. And in fact, they made it even more successful than before. And so I asked, well, how are you doing the books? How are you doing the accounting? How are you doing that stuff? And they pointed to this woman and said she's doing it. It wasn't that big of a firm, but it wasn't tiny, but she was doing it. So I said to her, well, you went from what was your prior job? And she said, well, I was working at the furnace, and she showed me the furnace, and she was working at this furnace in front of this open furnace all day long. I would have lasted 10 minutes. So it was an incredibly onerous, horrible kind of labor to be doing all day long, and certainly not conducive to being able to think a thought or have a bit of energy at the end of the day. Anyway, she became the person who was going to do the books. I knew she probably didn't have a lot of education. So I said, well, what was the hardest thing to learn? And she said, she didn't really want to answer. So she was hemming and hawing. She was embarrassed a little bit. But I kept pushing, and she still wouldn't answer. So I said, well, was it learning how to do the accounting, tasks? Was it learning accounting per se? She said, no. I said, well, was it learning, the computer and the software? She said, no. I said, well, was it learning how to interact with the other people who were making decisions and functioning? And she said, no. I said, well, I don't get it. What was the hardest thing? She said, well, first I had to learn to read. So the idea that people have that, working people are incapable of doing the empowered tasks, the tasks that involve concepts and that involve thinking and that involve engaging with others and so on and so forth, that working people can't do that all they can do is the rote labor, is total nonsense. Right? It's total nonsense. It's just as much nonsense as it was nonsense 50 years ago or 60 years ago to say women couldn't do that kind of labor. Women couldn't be doctors. Women could, which everybody thought was the case. That was nonsense. So is it nonsense that workers can't be. Okay, so here you have a workplace in which that nonsense is dealt with to a certain degree. But if you look closely, you discover, wait, there's a problem. She is the new accountant. Right? In other words, there is somebody working at that furnace where she was working, doing the same job she was doing before. And now she's the accountant. And for a while, she's going to be a wonderful and humane person. But over time, the fact that she's not doing any of that rote work, and that she's doing this more relaxed labor in an environment that's more comfortable, where the gap between her and everybody else in terms of the knowledge she has at her disposal in the democratic assembly, right, means that she's going to have more and more say, and they're going to have less and less say, and slowly but surely they're not even going to want to attend, and slowly but surely she's going to get tired of having to deal with them because she knows everything, and along with the others who are in those positions. And slowly but surely the position creates a new person. The position, she's not genetically any different than she was, but it's like getting a job as a prison guard, right? The nicest person in the world gets a job as a prison guard, and 2 years later, that person is probably a different person, right? Because of all the pressures, and because of all the constraints, and because of the ways of having to behave, and so on and so forth. It's just unavoidable. So, same thing here. So the point of this story is that when we take over a workplace, or when we start a workplace from scratch, and we're trying to create something that will be exemplary, and something that can provide a model, and something that can even melt into a better future, we have to not only get rid of ownership, but we have to get rid of that division of labor, because that will corrupt us, right? It will inexorably undo, right? And the same thing for markets, right? So we have to deal with those self-consciously and aware. While they're there, we have to just offset the ills of it rather than celebrating it. One other quick story. On that same trip to Argentina, I'm sitting in a room. There's about 50 representatives of these factories from around Argentina. And they want to talk about participatory economics. You know, that's what it's been called for, and they're not familiar with it. And I said, well, before we do that, let's at least have some reports about what you're doing, where you are. So we start to go around the room, and they start to give reports. And at first, everybody's very lively and upbeat, because they're meeting people from across Argentina who are doing things like what they're doing, occupying a factory, trying to create something more just and humane. But after a while, it starts to get pretty depressed, and then maudlin, and then people are crying. And the reason was because people were very honest. It was a context in which people were with like-minded people, and they could be honest. And they started telling the truth. And by the 7th or 8th person, one of the people who spoke put it this way. They said, you know, I never believed I would ever say anything like this, but I'm afraid Margaret Thatcher may be right. We took over the workplace, Margaret Thatcher being the British Prime Minister who said there is no alternative. We took over the workplace. We equalized the wages. We instituted a democratic assembly to make decisions. We were incredibly energetic and excited. We made it work. But now, 2 years later, all the old crap seems to be coming back. It's beginning to feel the way it felt before. We don't have any owners, but the alienation and the differences and the hostility and the class kind of dynamics are coming back, and it just seems to be built into who we are. So after a while, then I talked about balanced job complexes, and I talked about markets and said, look, what I think happened here isn't that human nature is overcoming your desires. Rather, what's overcoming your desires is that you hung on with an old institution, the old corporate division of labor, and you hung on with markets. And those two old institutions are swamping your aspirations and are undoing what you've accomplished. And it doesn't say that it's impossible. It just says that if you want to create a new workplace, a new kind of productive environment which is classless, you have to deal with those institutional pressures, and you have to come up with an alternative to that too. So that's my answer. I think it's very, very good that all kinds of experiments are being done, from co-ops to participatory budgeting, kind of a tiny partial aspect of participatory planning, to all sorts of other things. But to unite them with a clear, coherent understanding of what the alternative that they're moving toward is, so that they can keep moving toward it and so that they can combat all the obstacles along the way, is a crucial ingredient to their being sustainable and their going forward.
This was Context TV with Michael Albert. Thanks for watching and listening. You can get more information on Context TV on www.context-tv.de. My name is David Gößmann with Fabian Scheidler. We say goodbye.